Welcome to Yoga Teachers Masterclass. I'm Paula Mitten, and today I'm speaking with Rachel Scott. Rachel is a yoga teacher, a teacher trainer, mentor, and an author. She's got over 20 years experience in yoga, and I'm absolutely delighted to get the opportunity to speak with her today. So Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Paula, I'm delighted to be here.
You're welcome. So just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the yoga practice.
Well, I mean, like many of us, I was living in New York City back in the 90s and was totally stressed out, as I think everyone is living in New York City. And someone basically said to me, they're like, Rachel, you really, you need to either do some very calming drugs or maybe take a yoga class. Like, okay. So I went to yoga, and like many of us, I loved it. And what I really loved about it, I was an actor at the time in New York, or, aspiring actor, and everything was so competitive, and also it was so externally focused. And so the opportunity to practice yoga, I was amazed. I get to be in my body, and it doesn't matter. I don't have to compare myself to anybody else. It's a place to just be me. And I found that really nourishing and such an antidote to the kind of go get 'em lifestyle that, New York City and our culture tends to offer.
Yes. Yeah. And so talk to us about that whole idea of, because, the yoga practice taking you inwards, sometimes it can be the direct opposite, where we get focused on the external, and really what we're looking for is to let go of that.
Oh my gosh, totally. And especially now with with social media and Instagram and all of the pictures, it's becoming, people can't take a picture of your inner peace, right? So what happens is that yoga gets sort of transmitted as, a beautiful warrior two, or an amazing handstand. And because people are fighting for social media space online, it's kind of like the best pose wins. So now we're in this really aesthetic, part of yoga where everybody's trying to look, really kind of focusing on looking good, or how can I make my pose look amazing, rather than what the practice is really about, which is how do I go inside? How do I become more intimate and authentic with my relationship with myself? So yeah, I think we're in a bit of a conundrum right now in terms of the yoga culture, in terms of how can we actually teach to an internal practice when so much of our culture is now so aesthetic,
And so what do you do? How do you handle that with your classes and with your teacher trainees?
Yes. Well, these are two really amazing questions. And my classes basically focus on cultivating an authentic relationship with yourself. So I encourage my students to be, to really arrive on their mat. I wrote a post, actually, an article for the Huffington Post a while back called "Not Everyone Who Practices Yoga is Happy, and That's Okay." Because I feel like even so, there's this idea that when we go to yoga, we're supposed to be in a certain mindset. Like I'm supposed to be all calm and cool and collected. And I don't think that's what the practice actually does for us at all. The practice is a place for me. The practice is a place to create a container in which we can be more human, to experience everything that we might feel, sadness, anxiety. I've been in those paths for sure. I've gone down those roads. And so for me, the practice is a place to get really, really real with ourselves, not just mentally and emotionally, but also physically. And this comes to how every single person's body is unique. So in class, I think it's really important to educate our students that, hey, my body is going to be different than your body. My warrior two is going to be different than your warrior two. So not to teach so much to the aesthetics of the pose, but to the actions of the pose. So this kind of moves into the teacher training question, which is super interesting. So I've studied with Paul Greeley, who's like a master of skeletal variation, and really, I think, opened everybody's eyes to that. And I've also taken a couple of 6-day human dissection cadaver labs with the remarkable Gil Headley, and saw how the human body is, first of all, just freaking amazing and mysterious and like astonishing, but also how everybody is really different. And that what we see in the anatomy books, and my colleague and mentor Bernie Clark would speak to this as well, how there is no average. Like he mentions this in his latest book. He gives this whole description of how average is such an illusion. And whenever we see these pictures of bodies in anatomy books, we're seeing a model. We're seeing kind of this like abstract representation of a perhaps. And it's really just a shorthand way of understanding the body, but it doesn't represent reality. And so by doing these labs, and for the yoga teachers out there, they know, like looking at their students and seeing so many variations and so many, kind of wonderful expressions of human diversity. Like we really want to let our students know that's right, that they are different, that the shape of their hip socket is going to change the way that they can do each pose. So as a yoga teacher, I like to take it upon myself to educate students on that sometimes in class. And it can be something that's super simple, like, hey, when we're doing staff pose, bring your hands down to your hips. Not all of you are going to be able to touch the floor with your palm because your arms might be shorter proportionally than your torso. Even like empowering our students to recognize that, hey, yeah, like I have shorter arms, that's going to make some things much harder for me. Can give them a feeling of relief that they belong in that classroom too, even though they don't look like Yoga Journal. So that was an exciting rant.
Well, so mainly you're using your languaging and your skill of cueing as a teacher to inform your students of all of this knowledge that we know about the body.
Yes, and also I think yeah, usually it's languaging, but there's also a bit of inviting self-exploration with my students, in the sense of like when I'm teaching Warrior 2, especially if it's a class full of newer students that I haven't had as much exposure to, I will have people literally put their own hands on their hips and explore, hey, what's my range of motion here? How do my hips move this way? If I keep my knee over my ankle here, how much can I actually turn my pelvis towards the side of the mat? How much, and I wouldn't necessarily use anatomical terms because that might alienate them, but to experience, oh, my pelvis turns this much, and that's okay. And the student across from me can square her hips. Well, what a magical unicorn she is. But we don't all have to do that, right? It's really so I might have them touch themselves too, or do a couple of those little explorations in order to really sense that in their own body.
Mm-hmm. And so then when we're trying to get our students to let go of the competition, the competition of the unicorn compared to, whatever they're going to be. How do you do that? Because I feel like there's always an element of that in class where, the people are looking around and they're checking out what the person next to them is doing. So how do you get your students to then let go of that and just, be in their own space?
I think we should blindfold them. That's it. Actually, I have had them practice. I often have them practice with their eyes closed when they start. It's funny. I hadn't really put it in this context before, but when they start off class, I'll often have them do their child's pose, cat cow, just kind of like the warm-up stuff with their eyes closed, so that they move more inwardly rather than outwardly. I mean, there are things I think we can do. For me, it's mostly I'm a language kind of teacher. So for me, it's mostly to the cueing, or even theming about being empowered in your own space. I really love to use empowering language. So it's not, you can't do that. It's look at the magnificence of your own shape and what you can do. Teachers could use things like drishti and focal points and things like that as a way of kind of harnessing attention, focusing on yoga as a mental practice rather than a physical practice. I think it was Batabi Joyce who said something about like yoga is mind discipline or mind training. It's just, we just happen to use the instrument of our amazing body to get there, but it's all about this. So the more we can teach to reference, create a container for the real purpose of yoga, which is mind control and self-connection and spiritual connection, then I think the more the external kind of, obligation of it falls away a little bit. And then it becomes that the physical body is the instrument of pursuing these kind of more depthy purposes. But yeah, speaking to it is mostly what I do.
Yeah. And what about your thoughts on hands-on assisting? Do you do that? Or how do you feel about going in and physically adjusting people?
I am personally a huge fan, with caveats. Actually having a discussion with a good friend of mine recently about hands-on assist. And I love the power of human touch. Now, there are some big caveats to this, but I think that like the touch can convey so much information when it's done appropriately, when it's done compassionately, when it's done skillfully. My students love being touched for the most part. And I always ask permission first, always. So like, there's no exception, always in class I do, because I want to make sure sometimes people don't want to be touched. And so there's two layers of permission. There's one, getting the verbal permission, which is, if you don't want to be touched, let me know, or, to find a skillful way to do that. But then there's the second layer of permission, which is what they're not verbalizing, but what their body is saying, right? So for me in my classes, that's something that I feel comfortable bringing to them. I've practiced hands-on assist for a long time, and I feel confident in my ability to do it safely and very respectfully, and not do stupid assists, which deepen it and like break people or try to get them into a shape. I'm more about the actions of the assist, or even just like the embodiment of getting them in their bodies to feel something a little differently rather than fixing them. Because this comes down to, how do we as teachers approach our students, and newer teachers, and I was one of them for sure. Like, we want to be so helpful. So we see our students and we're like, this is what I was told the alignment was, and I want to fix my student, coming from such a loving place of wanting to share the knowledge, right? So well-intentioned. And yet we have to step back from the viewpoint of wanting to fix our students, and instead look at how I can support my students and what's the conversation I can have. So the second level of permission is, when I come into their space, how do they receive me? Like, is their body, like, I touch some people and they're like, oh my God, they're like, they're so happy. And then you touch some people and you're like, good work, like, that's right. So there's kind of what their body allows too. And it's important for teachers who want to do hands-on assist to practice on their friends and family, getting honest feedback about how to be skillful about reading the energetic level of response, and so that we can become really sensitive, because it's not just about what they're speaking, it's what their body is saying to us that we really want to communicate with. So there's some caveats to hands-on assist, but
yeah, because sometimes I feel like some teachers won't assist at all, because maybe there's a fear there, and then there's the other teachers that they just want to get their hands on somebody, anybody. And so, like, you want a purpose for why you want to know why you're stepping into someone's space, right?
I think that's so smart. Yeah. When in our teacher training, we have that one of the principles behind hands-on assist is clarity. And it's being so super clear in your intention, like having clean hands, clean energy. Like, there's a whole lot of clear things to that, but the intention and being really specific about why you're doing it and how you're intending to support them. The worst thing is to go over to someone and like pet them abstractly, like, it's like so creepy. We call it creepy fingers. Don't do that. But, yeah.
Right. Or knock them out of the pose.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like, knock them over. I know. Sorry.
So you know exactly why you're going in. You have your clear intention, and then you step in with the awareness of the student's energy before you ever put your hands on someone.
Yes, before you even touch them. Exactly. And I think some people think hands-on assist begin when you make contact, but just like you so beautifully articulated, it's about moving into their personal space. Begins way before you actually physically touch them.
Yeah. So then, when you've got all this awareness as a teacher of how you want to look after each student individually, and everybody is different, how do we put that into practice in classes that are like a vinyasa flow class or something where we're moving a little bit faster than a yin class or a hatha class? Is it possible to combine the two?
Ish. So basically whenever we're teaching vinyasa flow or teaching faster, that's why I think skillfully, you can teach flow really poorly, not poorly. You can teach you can teach flow really simply and I'll say basically, like I'd say a newer teacher might teach flow by just sort of calling out the poses. That's not a very elevated way of teaching a flow class. But to teach an elevated flow class where you actually do skillfully combine breath, movement, and appropriate alignment, that takes a lot of skill and practice because, as you say, because you're moving faster. The more poses you have and the more you're cueing the breath, the less you can cue alignment. Absolutely. So, so something that we talk about in teacher training, I'm an educator, so what I'm very interested in too is how do we teach our teachers to do this well? Is that I speak to something called best practices, which is an awareness that each student has skeletal variation, has their own unique form, own unique joint shapes, own unique, tension of connective tissue. And basically we're all so different shaped organs, different number of bones, like all of these things. Is to have an awareness of that the individuals are going to be different, but to speak to what will serve the majority of students in the room. But to be aware, I think this is important for teacher trainers too. It's like we want to have the container that recognizes individual variation and be aware that we are speaking in generalities almost all the time in a group class setting, right? So yes, it is impossible for me to speak to the individual, however, in like a flow class, to do that really well. But what I can do is I can create a container for the space where I empower my students to move to their own, basically, best feeling in a pose. I can empower my students to take care of themselves, and then I can skillfully cue in a way that will serve the majority of practitioners in the room. And that's kind of, I think, the best we can do in a class that is flowy, and until you stick them in down dog, and then you can pause and take a look at what's happening.
And what are you bringing into your cueing that helps the students to do that?
Yeah. So in my training, what we focus on is dual actions. So we focused on basically that there are universal actions in the body, and you cue one action basically against the other. Like a really obvious example would be soften your front ribs in, draw the heads of your arm bones back. Like those two actions in the body work against each other. And as you know, we've got like students who live here, and then we have students who live in the back bend. So one strategy that we can use is to cue both sides of those actions so that the students who do this are getting some of this, and the students who do this are getting some of this. And then it's kind of like you empower them to kind of figure out what their own personal habits are, cue both sides of it so they bring themselves into alignment. So that's one strategy, and you can do that all through the body, because in yoga we have so many different opposing actions happening all the time, which is what makes it so kind of cool and impossible. I say to my students, I'm like, yoga teachers say impossible things. We say, we say the most absurd things. In downward facing dog, we're like, lift your thighs up as you sink your heels towards the floor. It's like impossible, but we cue in riddles, like do all these opposing actions. But that's what makes it wonderful. But I think that can be a tool that helps us to kind of capture the most people.
Right. And then obviously you've got to encourage students to feel and to experience how the pose is for them, so as that they do what they need to do in the pose as opposed to what the person next to them needs to do in the pose.
Yeah. And so that would like svadhyaya and self-study and weaving, I think, an intention that yoga can be a tool towards self-study and towards improving, and this is a little bit more on the physical level of things, and towards improving our own sort of functional awareness of our body and our biomechanics. So if I come around and I've adjusted my beautiful, student Elaine 12 times by, you know, having her like broaden her back ribs because she likes to pop her ribs out. Eventually I'm going to be like, Elaine, you know, this is your pattern, right? So start to see this in everything that you do so that, you know, so, and I, you know what, and I think this is really important too, is that like a lot of times we want to empower our students to take responsibility for their own practice. So we need to relinquish our own authority as a yoga teacher sometimes. And that's a tricky balance. I mean, I'd be curious what you think about this, because it's, on the one hand, I want to come in and I want to have authority over the class and hold space for everybody. But on the other hand, I tell them, I've done classes where I tell students that they have to defy me at least once in class to practice doing that. I do. Like to practice not listening to the teacher, to listen to themselves. But I mean, what do you think? Like, how do we balance?
Yeah, I know it's tricky, right? Because we have to, you know, we have to guide. Like that's why the students are there. But then you see, you know, obviously, if you see people doing things, like some people are more likely to do too much, and some people are going to just hang out and do too little. So it's really about, like you say, pulling Elaine, but you know, after a while saying, look, you know, come on, you can do a bit more, or back up, or no, or feel it, notice it, maybe talk to them about how, like, where are you feeling that, so that you get them to make the decision on it as well.
You know, there's a really cool, I love that. And there's another technique that sometimes I'll use, and we call it reflective cueing. So, you know, when you give someone an action command, or you say like, lift your arms up, one kind of skill building thing you can do is to link that with an invitation to experience what you feel inside. So it's a way of linking the outer body practice with an inner body sensation. Like lift your arms up and feel the sides of your waist lengthen, or feel your arms straighten, like hug your triceps and feel your arms straighten. Like even just little things like that where we can, and I don't recommend cueing from feeling cues all the time, then you create a really mushy class, but to skillfully link, you're doing this, what are you experiencing? Or rather than tell them what they're experiencing, to say, do this, and now where are you feeling that in your body, to invite a more personalized inquiry. Like that's, and this is why I love yin. I love yin.
Yeah.
I love yin because there's such a wonderful space to really move into that individual sense and focus on where are you feeling this in your body, rather than everyone do this shape. It's like when I teach a yin class, it's like, okay, we're doing the outer hips now. Some of you are going to do this or this or this or this. Let's keep going. But this is where we're going. And so just want to props to Paul Greeley for his work in that, because his work really changed how I viewed bodies.
Yes. I think it's affected. I have interviewed Paul as well, and I think it's really affected how a lot of teachers teach now, because you know of the clarity on how everybody is so different to one another. There's no two bodies that are the same.
Yeah,
and it's even like when you're teaching and you're asking people to notice what's happening in the back body, or notice any sensations that are coming up in the area that you would expect them to feel something, and then it takes their attention to it, and hopefully that helps them to find that deeper level.
I think it can also be powerful to invite students occasionally to notice the non-obvious feelings, because sometimes it's like, okay, you're doing a forward fold, everyone expects to feel their hamstrings, and so we sort of mind map this position with this sensation, but then to broaden that invitation. So it's kind of like, okay, that might be the most obvious or surface sensation, but what's going on in your back, what's going on in your neck, so that right, so we cultivate this kind of more subtle thing. Because for some students, it's funny, I don't feel yoga teacher overly long hamstrings, I feel forward folds in my calves.
Yeah, and that's something actually that my teacher Vidya says as well. It's like, you can't really tell me what I'm feeling, because she'll feel it somewhere different. She's super flexible. So what I'm feeling is probably not what she's feeling, and vice versa. So it's hard to really tell what somebody's going to feel in a pose.
Yeah. Well, and I think this comes also to the, like, what is the purpose of yoga, right? Is the purpose of yoga so that we all do warrior two and feel the same thing? Or is the purpose of yoga to move through a series of shapes that allow us to experience ourselves and our relationship to ourselves with more intimacy, perhaps compassion, and to develop that self-awareness with ourselves, you know, an authentic relationship. Like to me, it's not about the poses. The poses are shapes that permit this journey.
Yeah. And then how we relate to the rest of our lives, you know, it sort of crosses over, doesn't it? That we start to be more compassionate with ourselves and more aware.
I'm definitely nicer for doing yoga.
So am I. Yeah. And actually, it was, I found when I started the practice that it was something that was very obvious very quickly, that I started to change just to become like a calmer, you know, less anxious type of person.
Yeah. That's why everyone comes to teacher training. When I do a little poll or I'm talking at info sessions about teacher training, almost all of us, like everyone, no one's there because their hamstrings got looser. No one's there because they got a cute yoga butt or whatever the thing is that you're supposed to do. I want to do Hanumanasana. Everyone's there because they feel more like connected, grounded, and sane, and calmer and kinder and more open-hearted. Like that's what brings them back, you know, and for some of them who've had like incredible anxiety or depression, because it helps to address those kind of mental states and move us on a path, you know, towards integration. And I think yoga helps us to literally remember, like pulling the different members of our body, remember ourselves and bring ourselves back to wholeness. So and that's why people might start for the open hamstrings, but they come back for the mind.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, Rachel, we're out of time.
Oh my gosh.
Already.
That's fun.
But for anyone who's interested in seeing more of what you do and your teachings, can you tell us where to find more info?
Yes, the easiest place to find me is at my website. So I'm Rachel Yoga. I have that URL. It tells you how long I've been in the business. Rachel Yoga. Or you can find me on social media. I'm Rachel Scott Yoga. And so come and visit, hang out. I love questions and I put videos out about lots of stuff. So I'm always interested in connecting with people.
Yeah, and you've lots of great videos on YouTube as well, right?
Yes, lots of stuff on YouTube and a couple of books out there floating in the universe too. So you can find me there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you today.
It was fun.
Good. Thank you to everybody for watching. I will see you again tomorrow with our next expert. So thank you so much.